The early church was an episcopal institution where bishops presided over lower clergy and laity in a specific locale. There was always hierarchy between the bishops. These locales and hierarchies were inherited from the apostles themselves. Those who inherited the mantles of Saints Peter or Paul or John or James, etc., were of a higher priority than those who inherited the mantle of Saints Mark, Titus, one of the blessed 70 lesser apostles, or whomever else. Being that Saints Peter, Paul, John, and James had evangelized specific locales, in their passing everyone they ordained had become their successors. Those who had inherited their episcopate from where they died, such as Rome, Ephesus, and Jerusalem, were chief among these successors. Hence, all the successors from the evangelized territory, i.e. jurisdiction, in effect became the local synod, with the chief successor, later known as a metropolitan and then patriarch, being the quote-unquote CEO of the organization. Now, being that Saints Peter and Paul were the most successful evangelists in the apostolic era, their territory was by far the largest, stretching from Asia Minor, Crete, and the Balkans to Italy and Spain. Both saints were also martyred in Rome, thereby making the Roman bishop the rightful inheritor of their mantles. The spiritual authority of the Roman bishop and the synod he belonged to, thereby, as a default, would be preeminent. However, as alluded to before, this didn't make the Roman bishop somehow exclusive in his preeminence. Saint James was the bishop of Jerusalem, and being martyred there, its jurisdiction was functionally independent. As history details, Saint John moved to Ephesus and was bishop there. Despite the city being originally evangelized by Saint Paul, John's presence in effect reset the region's apostolic succession and rescinded Rome's initial local jurisdictional rights. Due to no one taking offense at Saint John doing this, in effect consenting to this state of affairs, this is a demonstration that jurisdictions can shift and change by the consent of all. Now, the power of consent can't be understated. It was the operating principle behind the Council of Jerusalem as recorded in Acts 15. When the entirety of the church decided something, it was understood as evidence that God did so with them. The Lord taught that church discipline worked in the same way in Matthew 18, verses 18 through 20. In church history, the Holy Spirit's most ubiquitous works are not dazzling visual miracles. Rather, they are the daily workings of the Christian people in unity. When the whole church has consensus on something, this is proof of the Spirit's work. Hence, the church from apostolic times worked with a consensus-based ecclesiology. The drive to both identify and establish consensus is evident in all the ante-Nicene ecclesiastical controversies. Local councils operated according to a unanimous, as opposed to a majority vote, as consensus conveyed spiritual authority. The workings of several local synods held in concert with one another ideally were to all agree. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, local councils were held worldwide to determine the day to celebrate Pascha, the jurisdictional standing of the Ephesian Church vis-a-vis the Roman Church, the correct bishops of Rome during the Novatian controversy, the correct way to receive into the church those baptized from other Christian groups, and the deposition of Paul of Samosata in Antioch. Long before the church became an imperial institution, even without the logistical and legal means to collect all the local synods into one room in an ecumenical council to resolve an issue, the church always sought to establish universal consensus on matters of dispute. Rome was the specific subject of two of these controversies, the Ephesian ecclesiastical situation and the rebaptism issue. And both times, they lost. In the 2nd century, Rome re-entered communion with Ephesus, recognizing their jurisdictional claims. In the 3rd century, Rome abandoned the policy of Pope Saint Stephen of accepting the baptism of all heretics under Pope Dionysius, who then required that baptisms have correct form. Rome's earlier positions lacked the consensus of the rest of the church, who in response specifically censured Rome. Papal infallibility, direct jurisdiction, and the like were simply not on the radar. Also during the 3rd century, when Rome had a disputed election over who was a pope, Saint Pope Cornelius wrote a consecrational letter, or a systatic letter, defending his own claims against Novatian. His claim to be pope required both the consent of those within his own jurisdiction, like Saint Cyprian, and those in other jurisdictions, like Saint Pope Dionysius of Alexandria. This demonstrated two principles. The local synod must consent to its patriarch, in this case the Pope of Rome, and that to be a peer with the other patriarchs, their consent was necessary as well. Naturally, Depositions worked in the same way. When the local council of Antioch deposed the heretic Paul of Samosata, they sought the consent of the world's patriarchs. During the 4th century, Saint Constantine ended the persecution of Christianity. When the First Ecumenical Council occurred in Nicaea, those who attended, as well as their contemporaries, immediately recognized that the council was directed by God himself, just as the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem was centuries earlier. Unambiguously, all cited consent as the determining factor. In the subsequent semi-Arian controversy, Rome sometimes vetoed the Eastern councils due to these councils, unlike Nicaea, lacking consent, something Rome didn't always provide during this era. Not surprisingly, consent was cited by popes like Julius I, even when certain popes apostatized during the century due to torture, such as Saint Marcellinus and Liberius. Their synods neither freely gave consent. At the end of the 4th century, the Pope's communion was treated as optional during what is popularly called the Meletian Schism, as Rome lacked communion with Antioch but had communion with others who were also in communion with Antioch. During the 5th century, the Pope's decision was explicitly rejected in the Council of Carthage. His synod's excommunication treated as only locally binding during the Council of Ephesus, and his teachings, like the Tome of Leo, subject to review and accusations of heresy during the Council of Chalcedon. If one never read a papal honorific, one would naturally not infer even the seeds of Vatican I in the consciousness of the early Church. Yet, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire into Germanic kingdoms had set into motion geopolitical changes. These kingdoms had only nominal allegiance to Constantinople as Roman client states. Not long afterwards, Rome was occupied by Byzantium and treated as an occupied territory, beginning the Byzantium Papacy. During this period, his deposition with consent of the patriarchs was thrice repeated and twice accepted by Rome. The one other time the Pope recanted and his deposition was reversed. If one is to believe facts rather than words, as St. Pope Gregory the Great teaches, while the language surrounding the papacy evolved during this time, operating reality stayed the same. Unsurprisingly, allegedly weak popes like Gregory explicitly asserted Rome's jurisdiction to be strictly local. Yet, even the allegedly strong popes like St. Martin, while oftentimes stating things that sound very forceful, in fact reiterated the historical ecclesiology of the Church. For example, Pope Martin explicitly asserted power was lacking by himself to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem, a statement irreconcilable with the Vatican I doctrine of direct jurisdiction. Other popes are the same. Their actions are always inconsistent with such Vatican I ideas. It's difficult to overemphasize how important of a principle of weighing actions above words in isolation is for the historian. The scientific method, for example, tests a theory and through direct observation confirms or denies the truth of a theory. If history is a legitimate social science, surely the actions of historical actors are the tests that confirm or deny interpretations given by historians to their words. In any event, perhaps the most important statement for the students of a pre-Great Schism papacy is found in the minutes of the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea II. The council, in Session 6, explicitly defines what an ecumenical council is by contrasting itself with a pseudo-ecumenical council, that of Hieria. The Council of Hieria did not enjoy the cooperation of the then Pope of Rome or his priests, neither by means of his representatives or an encyclical letter, as is the rule for the councils, nor did it win the assent of the patriarchs of the East, of Alexandria, Antioch, and the Holy City, or of their priests and bishops, nor did their voice, like that of the apostles, go out into the whole earth or their words to the ends of the world, as did those of the 6 holy ecumenical councils. As one can see, an ecumenical council is not an exercise of the Pope of Rome decreeing one to be so. Rather, the Pope of Rome cooperates with his synod, while the patriarchs of the East assent. The Greek implies conviction and activity, as well as the rest of the Church worldwide. Many years before Nicaea II, the Byzantine papacy officially ended, due to conflicting political players in the Italian peninsula, specifically the Franks and the Lombards. When Byzantine power collapsed, the city of Rome itself was able to play the Franks against the Lombards in order to attain to a degree of political independence. In effect, the Papal States were created, with ecclesiastical reforms undertaken with the intent to further insulate Roman ecclesiastical business from foreign political usurpation. Over time, the Franks would dominate papal business. The Franks, after all, were in a geopolitical struggle against the Byzantines, and other than the briefest moments of reapproachment, sought political, military, and ecclesiastical means to dominate their foe. Hence, being coerced by the Franks, Rome, during the 9th century, would turn decidedly against the Byzantines and expound a dramatical new ecclesiology. This sudden shift revolved around two men specifically: Anastasius, the librarian, a Frankish ghostwriter and de facto head diplomat for Popes Nicholas, Adrian II, and John VIII, and Saint Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople. For the first time, papal chanceries explicitly rejected consensus-based ecclesiology. Coincidentally, at the exact same time, forged documents offering a historical pedigree for these changes conveniently were exploited. At minimal, this included the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, but the case will be made that significant forgeries were inserted in the Latin minutes of Nicaea II and Constantinople. All of these writings either came from the pen of Anastasius or were specifically popularized internationally by himself. Anastasius also gave voice to new ideas that would become pivotal to modern papacy, such as papal infallibility. In effect, Anastasius reinvented or rebooted the office of the papacy to confront the geopolitical realities of his day. Suddenly, in the 870s, the Byzantines were retaking southern Italy. Political alliances with Constantinople, vis-a-vis collapsing Frankish power, became preferable for the sake of the papal state's stability. The anti-Byzantine Anastasius died or was retired. Interestingly, his ideas were largely not set aside by Pope John VIII during the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, but they were muted enough to make peace with Photius. This would prove to be the last gasp for the Orthodox papacy. By the eve of the Crusades, Eastern Frankish ecclesiastics subsumed power within the College of Cardinals. A reform program was initiated that largely depended upon precedents from Anastasius' writings and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. They constitutionally changed the Roman Church in order to make it more independent of local Italian nobility, as well as Frankish, the Holy Roman Empire, meddling. Anastasius' dissemination of a slew of forgeries had allowed their innovative ideas to marinate in Rome for 2 centuries. These were understandably confused to be authentic patristic witnesses. Geopolitical necessities now incentivized putting them into practice. This specific combination of historical incidences decisively changed the papacy for good. The papacy had finally fallen.